Today, we will take a closer look as to how do we multiply radicals, where radicals is just another fancy way to say square roots. Now, the main idea is that whenever we're multiplying radicals or square roots, we are going to pay a lot of attention as to what's going inside the square roots. So when we're multiplying square roots, we're going to concentrate on the inside of the square roots. You will see how this idea is developed along the problems that we're going to be doing today. But just keep this idea in mind. When we're multiplying radicals, we concentrate on the inside of the square root. So let's see. This, well, first they're asking us to simplify. Now, notice here that we're multiplying two square roots. Now, how can we multiply square roots? Just like in the main idea, the first thing that you need to pay attention is, are they the same square roots? Whenever there's no number in the square roots, there's always an imaginary 2. If they have the same root, then you can multiply. Now that we know they have the same root, because both of them have an imaginary 2 there, then we're going to concentrate on the insides. That is, square root of 5 times the square root of 10, that's the same as the square root of 5 times 10. Whatever we have inside the square root, that's what we're going to be multiplying. And now this becomes just 50, square root of 50. Let's try that again. Example B. Well, don't pay too much attention to C yet. So if we look at B, we want to multiply the square roots. Do they have the same root here? Yes. There's always, if you don't see anything there, there's always an imaginary 2 there. And now that we know they have the same square root, if we're multiplying, we're pretty much just going to be multiplying the insides. So now this just becomes square root of 2, 6 times 6, which is just going to become square root of 2, 36, where we know that the square root of 2 is just, the square root of 36 is just 6. So this is how you multiply square roots. If they have the same root, you just multiply the insides, which in this case the insides were 6 and 6. That's why we multiply 6 times 6 inside. And in here, our insides were 5 and 10. So that's why we multiply 5 and 10 inside. So now, if we pay attention to C here, notice that it becomes a little bit more challenging in some sense. But let's see. We are going to multiply the following. We're going to use the method of distribution. So now, let's distribute the following. Square root of 3, you know that you need to distribute to every single term inside here. So now, every time you multiply a square root times a number, you cannot combine this. The square root of 3 times 5, this is not the same as the square root of 15. This is not true. Because notice that here the 5 does not have a square root, so you cannot just multiply the insides. So what we're going to do here is the following. When you multiply square root times a number, you're going to put the number outside the square root. So square root of 3 times 5, that's the same as 5 square root of 3. So keep that in mind. A square root times a number, you can just put the number in front of the square root. And now we have square root of 3 times 3, which from the previous examples, we know that square root of 3 times square root of 3, both of them have the same root here. There's always an imaginary 2. So what we can do, we can just multiply the insides. So now becomes 3 times 3, which is just the square root of 9. So plus square root of 9. Can we simplify the following? Well, notice that the square root of 9 is 3, so we can rewrite this as 5 square root of 3 plus 3. And we're done. Now let's look at example D. Here, in example D, again, we're going to distribute. So the outside, you first need to distribute to the first expression here. So now we're going to have square root of 3b times 6. Notice that both of them have the same square root, so we're just going to multiply the insides. So now this becomes the square root of 3b times 6 plus Let's just distribute this again. Notice that both of them have the same square root, so we're going to multiply the insides. So now this becomes 3b times 10. And now let's see. Let's try to see if we can simplify what's happening inside the square roots. So now we're going to have 3b times 6, that's 18b, plus square root 3b times 10, that's 30b's. And we're done. So here's our last example. It's a little more challenging, but we're still going to follow the same rules. Let me just move this. So now let's distribute. Notice that here your first term is this whole thing, negative 2 square root of 3. This whole thing you need to distribute times the square root of 3. Now let's perform the multiplication here on the side. So now we're going to have negative 2 square root of 3 times, don't know why this is doing that, but times square root of 3. Okay, so this is essentially what we're doing. But let's do the multiplication here on the side to understand it. So now what this is going to happen is that the square roots, you can still multiply them, and the number or the coefficient, you can just leave it outside. So what this means is that negative 2 square root of 3 times square root of 3, this is essentially the same as negative 2 times you multiply the insides of the square roots. And now this becomes negative 2 square root of 9. But we know that the square root of 9 is just 3, so this becomes negative 2 times 3, which is just negative 6. So we know that negative 2 square root of 3 times the square root of 3, that is just equal to negative 6. We just did it here. So now let's distribute that again. But now we're going to distribute to a negative 5. So now let's perform the multiplication here on the side as well. We are going to do negative 2 square root of 3 times negative 5. So notice here that we're multiplying numbers. Square root of 2, negative 2 square root of 3 times negative 5. We can multiply the numbers. The negative 2, you can multiply with the negative 5. So now this becomes positive 10. The square root, we have not done anything to it, so just leave it alone. So that means that negative 2 square root of 3 times negative 5, that's the same as just positive 10 square root of 3. So if we perform this multiplication, you know that negative 2 square root of 3 times negative 5, that's the same as just 10b. 10 square root of 3. We're done distributing the first. So now let's just distribute the second. So now we're going to have 2 times square root of 3. And we know that if we multiply a number times the square root, you can just put the number in front of the square root. So that's excellent. And now 2 times negative 5, well, that's a simple number, which is just negative 10. Now, we're almost done here. This is considered your final answer, but you can simplify the following. Notice that here, 10 square root of 3 and 2 square root of 3, they have square root of 3's on them. So you can think about square roots as some kind of a variable. So that means that you can combine them. So that means that 10 square root of 3 plus 2 square root of 3, that's the same as 12 square root of 3. Again, you can think about square roots as some kind of a variable. They have the same variable, so you can just combine the coefficients. 10 plus 2, that's 12. 12 what? 12 square roots of 3. And then at the end, you can just combine these two as well. So that now becomes negative 16. Excellent. So I know I said that it was the last example, but I think we have one here. Yeah. So let's practice that again. Now, let's look at example F now. Let's erase this. Excellent. So now again, all we're doing here is FOIL and following the rules that we just explained. So here we have the first distribution. Square root of 5 times square root of 5. They have the same roots, So we can multiply the insides. So now this becomes 5 times 5. So that's the first distribution. So now let's distribute that again. Square root of 5 times square root of 3. Well, that's the same as square root of 5 times 3. Excellent. So we're done distributing the square root of 5. Now we need to distribute the negative square root of 3. So if we distribute that, now that's going to become negative times a positive. That's a negative. Square root times a square root. We multiply the insides. So that's going to be 3 times 5. Distribute that again. Negative times a positive. That's a negative. When you multiply two square roots, you multiply the insides. So that's going to be 3 times 3. So now let's see, can we simplify this? Well, 5 times 5, that's the square root of 25. 5 times 3, that's 15. 5 times 3, that's still 15. Minus 3 times 3, that's 9. Now, when you're dealing with square roots, try to see if you can simplify. Well, we know that square root of 25, this is nothing than just 5. We don't know the square root of 15, so let's just leave it like that. Square root of 15. We don't know this. We know this we can leave this as negative square root of 15 minus the square root of 9. This is 3. But now notice here that we have square root of 15 minus square root of 15. Anytime you subtract anything by itself, it's always going to cancel out. So now we essentially have 5 minus 3, which is just 2. Now, here's your entrance ticket. Just multiply the first one. Simplify this. Just simplify the following.